The Destiny community is notorious for being split when it comes to game philosophies. Like just the other week, I asked if resilience was too strong in PvE, and this was the result. A 50-50 split right down the middle, just 2,000 votes in. Welcome to the top 7 community splits in history. Starting off is the relationship between resilience and damage resistance. One half of the community says it's too strong and the game is just too easy because of it, but the other half thinks it's completely fine or could even be stronger. I kept thinking to myself, why are we even in this situation? And I think a bit of a history lesson helps point this out. See, in the beginning, resilience only had one impact: how much health you had. Since the window of health is only between 185 and 200, it was kinda useless for PvE entirely. In fact, the only benefit it brought was surviving certain thresholds for PvP. Because of this, Bungie started to add functionalities to resilience so that people might want to use it more. Over the course of the game, it went from that one function all the way up to 6, like barricade cooldowns, stasis breakout resilience, the durability of bubble or well of radiance, flinch resistance, and then the biggest one of them all, damage taken from combatants. On May 24th, 2022, the 6th functionality of resilience would make it the most important stat for all of PvE in the entire game. What's crazy about this is we had no warning. In fact, it was just the second half of one sentence in a 5,000 word patch note release. Under that resilience bullet were some changes to flinch, and then hey, why not a little bit of damage resistance versus PvE combatants? Thinking about the two sides, you immediately had people angry that the game got so much easier overnight. Like the flip of a switch, you could all of a sudden go into any activity and pretty well dominate it. This sentiment was often faced by the other half of the community, calling them elitists. That opinion was that everybody should be happy newcomers are able to take on way more activities, period. If we want more people playing the game, then we need to open up the door for all of them. I started thinking more about this though, because the split of perspectives was so quick to get out of hand, and then I realized what had happened right before all of this. Bungie nerfed a mod called Protective Light. It's no longer in the game, but for context, it gave you damage resistance when you were critically low on health. A lot of people loved it and a lot of people hated it. Before the whole resilience thing, Bungie came out and nerfed this one pretty hard, and their reasoning was that it was too dominant and felt like too much of a mandatory mod. When they did that, half the community was vocal about their discontent, while the other half was pretty pumped for a new challenge. So if you think about it, it kind of set the stage for when this resilience thing took over, giving a passive 40% damage resistance at all times. It was like putting gasoline on a fire. We had just gone through this turmoil around Protective Light, and now with the resilience changes, you had hardcore players feeling like casuals got the win over Bungie. You hear that a lot nowadays, like the casuals are getting their way. But then on the flip side, casual players felt like the elitists finally got what they deserved. Protective Light was nerfed, so Bungie balanced it out by introducing this new function to resilience. Well, the truth is, the community has never really settled on this, and Bungie did eventually try and find a middle ground by reducing that damage resistance at 100 resilience. They changed it from 40% down to 30, and even when we focus on that specific nerf alone, my poll had reached 19,000 votes, and look at the final split. 65% of you would have left 100 resilience at 40% damage reduction. Only 35% were happy with that nerf and probably want resilience to do even less. Number 2 is the Bungie and Activision split. One half thinks it was great that that happened in 2019, but the other half thinks that that's the reason we've had so many issues in a post-Shadowkeep era. To really understand the two perspectives though, you need context into that relationship and the impact it's had on us as a community. When Bungie launched Destiny 1, it was from the backing of publishing giant Activision on a 10-year deal. $500 million in marketing and taglines like "from the creators of Halo and the company that brought you Call of Duty." The hype was very real and expectations were high. Sales on D1 hit the ground running, but fairly quickly a somewhat lukewarm sentiment came with those content droughts. Seasonal DLCs obviously helped, but ultimately Activision wanted more content, so when it came to Destiny 2, they brought in other studios to help out. With Vicarious Visions and High Moon added to the table to push more content, some monetization practices were also introduced to compensate for that, and they were noticeably more aggressive than the first game. That being public information led people to believe Activision was wholly responsible for microtransactions in Destiny 2, which is where the community really started to split. One side leaned into that speculation a lot and vocalized their absolute hate for Activision, but the other side wasn't too sure if it was truly Activision or maybe just Bungie. Fast forwarding 2 years after the launch, both companies would end up parting ways. It was publicly stated that Destiny was not meeting financial expectations, and this felt weird to hear because the game was kind of reaching its golden era. All the while, Activision was telling the world it failed to meet sales targets. This made them look money hungry, and so the side who hated Activision to begin with were more than happy to lose the quote-unquote corporate shackles. There were even headlines proclaiming January 10th as Destiny Freedom Day. The other side of the community, however, had their seeds of doubt. Warnings were being sent out of how hard it's going to be for Bungie. Warnings that many of the issues may have stemmed from them internally and not Activision. Warnings that darker days would be ahead of us. Sure enough, that very same year, a probably well-intentioned mistake happens. Bungie opened up about how the exotic mission 0 Hour was funded. In the spirit of transparency, they let the community know that it was funded by the sales of one ornament bundle. Now suddenly those arguments started to flare up again all over social media, and not soon after, Destiny had what many people to believe is one of its lowest points in the game's Go Fast era. Headlines started to pop up like, "I hate that I miss Activision." Bungie's leadership decisions are falling flat. More and more arguments would take place, and discussions around how Destiny's quote-unquote Freedom Day may have actually killed it. Well, it's been 4 years now since that split, and we still have people talking about it. I kid you not, just the other day I was watching Astacross on stream and happened to tune in right as he was discussing this very subject.
Bungie was with Activision, and then when they split, they were like, we're going to go do our own thing. And we bought into it. Like, I really bought into that narrative. I was like, man, dude, do it. But honestly, as time has gone on, it's the same, but with more bucks. In my opinion, you know, the split was not because they felt like they were being held back from being super creative here. The split happened purely out of monetary gain, but we romantically believed in it.
How about skill-based matchmaking, SBMM for short? It's one of the most widely discussed topics in the video game industry and comes with some of the strongest opinions out there. It feels like people either hate it with a passion or absolutely advocate for it. When Destiny 1 launched, it had no SBMM. It was just a brand new exploration game that happened to have a PvP mode similar to Halo's arena shooter. The focus was all about quick matchmaking. Let's get people into their games as soon as possible to experience this brand new gunplay. And like any other game, as the Destiny franchise aged, people's skill sets continued to improve, and a true separation between veteran players and new players was becoming apparent. This is where the well-known pub stomping term comes into play, forcing developers with the ultimate question: do we intervene? On one hand, you have weaker players queue up in the Crucible and get completely crushed. You have that happen enough times and you've lost them as a customer. Getting stomped on is not fun. But on the other hand, you have portions of the community that would argue it's part of the process. Generally speaking, when you want to improve at something in life, you're going to suck at the beginning. You're going to fail, like a lot. But then eventually you're going to be good, and going through that whole arc is worth experiencing because when you start to consistently dominate, you feel that hard work paying off. So where does skill-based matchmaking fit in the middle? It tries to match people of similar skill so that if a brand new player boots up the game and goes into Crucible, they'll be playing people who are also brand new or just very inexperienced. You could still lose if you play bad, but you're not going to go 0-23 or something like that, so you might keep trying and not become a lost customer. The philosophy on that side is somewhat comparable to sport, because if you were to put a toddler against, say, LeBron James, they will never improve. The reason is because it takes some ball control to develop that side of the game. Never touch the ball, never learn. So there has to be some kind of protection. But where you draw the line is what splits this community so harshly. On the other side of the spectrum, you have people who've put thousands of hours going through that improvement arc I talked about, and in the flick of a switch, when you turn SBMM on, they're made to feel like it was for nothing. And the reason they feel that way is because all of a sudden the brain isn't experiencing that reward from all the hard work, because dominating a match becomes extremely rare. They don't get to play with lesser skilled friends anymore, and now every game is a sweat fest, which, by the way, is what fuels a lot of the fire too. Most elite players actually welcome a challenge, but there's always a cost. When the game tries to find the right people to pair you with skill-wise, it can't prioritize connection as much, which leads to long matchmaking times and lobbies filled with lag. Now, sadly, I think the trickiest part of it all is that it can be really hard to truly correlate what's best for the total player population, because when you go back and do the research, Bungie has accidentally added or removed it in the background so many times it's tough to gauge. When you add outside factors like loot incentives or triumphs, you end up with this weird, awkward situation where the community is not only split, but arguing with a lot of hate on what they think the solution might be, and we could end up with something like lobby balancing, which I think everyone agrees was not the best for the game. In any case, there's an endless amount of speculation out there, which unfortunately continues to drive home the wedge between both sides, and who knows what game is going to figure it out first. But okay, let's talk about callouts. Say you're fighting Atheon in the Vault of Glass raid. Your teammates get teleported in, and you've got to be the one to call out which oracles they need to shoot. Your name is Frostbolt, and this is what comes out of your mouth.
Oh, I'm watching. Oh, I Frost got it.
Okay, second one is first, first one is second, third one is third.
Oh my gosh.
What?
On a more serious note, why can we not just agree to some damn callouts, people? The infamous Oryx location, front or back. Literally hundreds of encounters in Destiny needing callouts, but for some reason, we get so split on some of them. I ran another poll asking all of you, and look how it started. 5,000 votes in, and it was the same situation as Resilience, a 50-50 split right down the middle. And I will admit, there was a lot of fun that spawned out of this, like the McDonald's order, Among Us, or even VOW, but quite possibly the most accurate one being this. Since the Dreadnought is a ship, you can argue that Oryx is at the bow. But this ain't the only time we've been split. From the bombs encounter in Deepstone Crypt to Vow of Disciples' million symbols, we love a good argument. I kind of preferred Ice Cream over Enter, but I gotta say I respect the amount of effort people do put into providing clarity. Like, take a look at this 3D image. It's just amazing how often the community does rally together to come up with stuff like this. And if I had to guess, Bungie's been trolling a little bit by leaning into this vulnerability of ours, because it's been 3 months since the Root of Nightmares raid that came out with Lightfall, and I swear we still have a bit of confusion. So I think the real question is, can we just stick to close and far, top and bottom, maybe numbers only? But let's talk about sunsetting, the product of so many things like power creep, player retention systems, internal resourcing, game stability, all these issues that Bungie wanted to fix because Destiny 2 has been running way longer than expected. The solution was a revolving door of content. New stuff comes in, old stuff obsolete. Many people hated this idea, like right out the gate, but there was a good chunk of the community that had high hopes for it. To understand why the split was so visceral on this, you have to realize where the game was at. Original plans would have likely had us playing Destiny 3 by now, and speculation around the whole concept of sunsetting was that it was a haphazard way of dealing with the fact that we're still playing D2 right now 6 years after its launch. The continuation of Destiny 2 was facing Bungie with a problem that needed attacking from multiple angles, and on a Wednesday just 1 month before COVID took the world by storm, we were greeted with the 2020 Director's Cut. The game director at that time, Luke Smith, wrote a section labeled Weapons Forever: The Problem. He explained that Destiny weapon design can be projected onto a pyramid where the peak, most desirable weapons are at the top. If everybody only wants those, then adding new loot at the bottom will do nothing for engagement, and suddenly you're in this vicious cycle of releasing endlessly upgraded loot. Well, that doesn't work because the pyramid just becomes a straight line and is the definition of power creep. Plus, everything that is on the bottom, despite not being used much, still needs to be vetted and tested with every iteration of game patches, taking dev time away from creating new content. Sunsetting was Bungie's answer to this whole problem, to effectively place a 9 to 15 month shelf life on all legendary weapons. That would mean the weapon you're holding right now probably wouldn't impact the game's balance in a year's time, and as a result, prevent longer-term problems. Now, this concept was an interesting split in the community because a large part of the player base was very upset that Bungie would even be willing to render the items their customers grinded for as basically useless. But then another large group of people were also yelling, "Chill out, let's see how it plays out," because they were excited at the possibility of finally getting a surplus of actual new and good content. Now, funny enough, Destiny 1 had already experimented with sunsetting. When its year 2 came around, everything in the game, including exotics, were all left behind a power cap. So I think they just figured, what's the harm in doing it again? Well, I'll tell you, because when it kicked off with the launch of Beyond Light, in one split second, 76% of all legendary weapons in the history of the game were toast. Beyond Light did bring in around 30 new guns, but when there's over 350 that are Thanos snapped, suddenly a 6% addition to the weapon base isn't very significant. People ended up in weird situations where their favorite weapon was too weak for meaningful content, but too well loved to dismantle. Now, I don't want to blame this on why everyone's vaults are full, because I think that's just human nature, but it certainly impacted my vault. That being said, there were still strong advocates for why this concept on paper was very hopeful. If there was going to be better content more frequently thanks to dev time being freed up, then this momentary DLC of shallow weapon base could totally be worth it. If the future meant more exciting and unique powerful weapons with easier to achieve god rolls, knowing that they're going to cycle through the content calendar, it could be worth it. If the resource allocation could be spent on core game modes like Strikes, Crucible, Gambit, new raids, it could be worth it, right? Well, the two sides would continue to argue pretty intensely each and every day until Bungie ultimately walked back sunsetting just 4 months after its introduction to the live game. After that, the disagreements shifted from whether or not sunsetting was good or bad to whether or not it was the root cause of this awful cycle of reskins and perk replacements. Situations like having 5 versions of a Mindbender's shotgun, different perk pools for the same weapon, basically causing FOMO all over the community. This BXR, for example, even though it's a craftable pulse rifle, you cannot get rangefinder snapshot anymore. There's just nothing you can do about it. People still talk to this day on whether or not sunsetting was the catalyst to all of it. Okay, controller versus mouse and keyboard. Aim assist versus aiming with your whole arm, right? Many Destiny balance decisions have arguably been shaped by the simple fact that this community split exists. You see, Destiny 1 was designed for controllers. There were, of course, a few Zim users back then, even a well-known and respected creator by the name of Dr. Lupo, but not too much attention on that because we were, for the most part, all on controller. When Destiny 2 came out, however, Bungie made the decision to open it up to PC. The likes of Shroud, Tim the Tatman, Dr. Disrespect, Ninja, you name it. All these enormous communities were ready to join thanks to it being on PC. And it was smooth between the two inputs. Like if you happened to want to use controller but still play PC, you could right out the gate. There wasn't that much fuel to the fire in that regard at launch because we were all just really excited about this new sequel. Now in the beginning, platforms were exclusive, so you didn't have the ability to play on all 3 platforms seamlessly. It was kind of one or the other unless you were willing to do everything multiple times. And this is important because it meant that most controller players were still on console. After all, computers are really expensive and next-gen consoles hadn't released yet, so people kind of already owned what they needed to play the game. This is where the split started to evolve. Early jabs from the PC community were that console lobbies were a bit of a joke when it comes to skill level, which is a pretty rough way to start a relationship if you ask me. There were some arguments that controller was too forgiving on PC, but it wasn't widely discussed because the percentage of players in that situation was still relatively low, with most of them being on console. Things got amplified, however, in 2019 when Bungie introduced cross-save. All of a sudden, you had a bunch of people who were willing to upgrade to PC, but had been kind of waiting. Up until this point, if someone had tried to move to PC, they had to start from scratch. Cross-save made it so they could finally do that without losing thousands of hours they'd sunk into their character. This saw an immediate increase in the player population using controllers on PC because a lot of them came from console. And that raised a huge amount of scrutiny when it came to balancing inputs. People like Drewski would get a ton of flack for using controller, which ultimately led him to make videos digging into this stuff. Things like how much aim assist there truly is on a mouse input versus controller. All those kinds of details where if you think about it, someone doesn't just go ahead and do that unless they feel the need to defend themselves from a clear community split. Then if we fast forward to 2021, Bungie introduced cross-play. This is different from cross-save, which was just the merging of the account progression thing. Cross-play was the system that allowed people of any platform to play with each other, so now the split really took off. When a player like Walla can flick 180 degrees and nail a headshot with a mouse in a split second, how much help should Bungie provide controller players to compensate for that? It's not an easy question to answer because it varies so much based on skill. A brand new player on mouse versus a brand new player on controller is dramatically different from a mouse and keyboard veteran versus a controller vet. There was a period of time in Destiny where you really couldn't beat an experienced controller sniper on PC. Every Crucible tournament out there ended up having restrictions around how many snipers could be in a game, whether they were controller or mouse and keyboard, all in a means to maintain game flow. And it does ultimately shape what Bungie decides because history shows they've had a series of tweaks to snipers specifically to try and balance that very issue. But it is safe to say that even if they're doing a decent job, the community will probably never agree on which one is better or worse. And then you have the day one raid experience. This was a bit of a hot topic in the past, but it really ramped up after the launch of Root of Nightmares. The bottom line is a big chunk of Destiny players think that day one raids have gotten too easy. That side of the community is all about a once a year challenge to really test their limits to an absolute extreme. But then the other side of the community is full of eager, less experienced players who also want to try this thing out. And this brings Bungie its two predicaments: day one emblems and raid difficulty. Now, to understand why the community became so split, we have to go back to March 5th, 2022, when Vow of the Disciple launched. Same deal as always, you had to complete a difficult raid in under 24 hours to get a day one emblem. The big difference here was that it launched on a Saturday. This was done because most people work on Fridays and have the weekends off, but unfortunately brought a slew of technical issues.
Yesterday was an absolute train wreck. That was the worst raid launch I have ever seen.
Bungie themselves didn't have appropriate staffing that day, and the result was a complete gong show. With how angry people were getting from losing time within that 24-hour window, they actually extended that day one emblem to 48 hours. Well, one half of the community was pumped by this. All the issues they ran into on day one were just forgiven. They were able to get some sleep, come back fresh, and still secure that rare emblem. The flip side, though, comes with people who still finished within the original 24 hours. Extending contest difficulty was fine, but to then hand out the emblem for beating it in the 47th hour, that pissed some people off. Twitter went nuts with people fighting each other, and suddenly Bungie had to balance both the emblem criteria and raid difficulty to try and appease both sides. So after Vow of Disciple's complete disaster, Bungie's next raid was King's Fall, a reskin from Destiny 1. Because it was a reprised raid, this meant that people would already understand the mechanics and should have a higher chance of beating it. They ultimately moved it back to a Friday and stuck with the OG 24-hour window for your emblem. 345,000 people ended up trying it out with a 14% completion rate. The catch, however, was that because this is a reskinned raid, you have to finish it a second time under challenge mode if you want to secure that emblem. That criteria filtered out a bunch of people and saw only 5% achieve it. On the 24-hour comparison, this was still much higher than the 1% who finished Vow, but lower than the 8% who did it in 48. It was generally assumed that Bungie found that balance they were looking for, which is why there was such an uproar when the Root of Nightmares launched. The same number of people attempted Lightfall's new raid at roughly 350,000. The 24-hour completion rate, however, was 25% compared to King's Fall's 14. The experts in our community were not happy. How could a brand new raid where you know none of the mechanics have nearly double the completion rate of a previous raid where you already did know what to do? Then to really stir things up, Bungie actually went back to the 48 hours for your quote-unquote day one emblem. That completion rate was almost 50% and caused a massive dispute across our community. On one hand, you had veteran players who didn't feel challenged at all. World's First was 2.5 hours, and for these players to spend all year preparing for this just to have it end so quickly was devastating. The unfortunate thing is that those sentiments are often seen as gatekeeping, which just fuels the community divide even further. Newer players maybe did slave away for 20 to 30 hours, or maybe they didn't even succeed at all in the 48-hour window. From Reddit posts to YouTube videos, it's clear the community is not finding a common ground when it comes to raid difficulty. Bungie will forever struggle to answer this question because the core audience is getting better and better year after year, and somehow Bungie has to make it hard enough for that side to be challenged, but then also try and welcome all brand new players if they want to increase player population. It's a delicate balancing act, and with the Final Shape's supposed in-game LFG, this is only going to amplify just how important nailing the perfect raid difficulty truly is. So let me ask you this. Do you think the next raid should be harder than Ron or just the same? And I think it's a good segue into the real all-time split in Destiny history. Which character is truly best? Because I hosted a $1,000 competition putting Warlocks, Hunters, and Titans all against each other in a 3v3v3 10 challenge gauntlet. Click this video right here to find out who might truly be the best.